He watched his wife of 7 years kissing another man. The expensive silk sheets he'd bought for their anniversary were tangled around them, and Ashley didn't even have the decency to look ashamed when she finally noticed him, standing in the doorway of their own bedroom, his heart shattering into a million pieces. "Tony," she said, her voice flat, emotionless. "You're home early. That was it. No apology, no explanation. Just a statement of fact, as if he'd interrupted her reading a book rather than destroying their marriage. The man in his bedsome yoga instructor named Derek, with perfectly sculpted abs and a man bun, at least had the grace to look uncomfortable as he scrambled for his clothes. How long? Tony's voice cracked, and he hated himself for it. He was supposed to be strong. He was Tony Martinez, the guy who'd built a small construction company from nothing, who'd worked 70-hour weeks to give Ashley the life she said she wanted. Ashley sighed, running her fingers through her highlighted blonde hair. "Does it matter?" "Yes," he whispered. "It matters to me." She shrugged, and that casual gesture hurt more than anything else. "A few months, maybe longer. I don't keep track. Tony, you're never here anyway." The accusation stung because there was truth in it. He'd been working constantly, taking every project, every opportunity to build their future. But he'd been doing it for them. For her. "I was working for us," he said. "For our future." "Our future?" Ashley laughed, a cold sound that echoed in the spacious bedroom of the house he'd bought for her. "Tony, look around. You gave me a nice house in a decent neighborhood. Sure, but I didn't marry you to be comfortable. I married you because I thought you were going somewhere. I am going somewhere. The business is growing. You're a contractor, Tony. You fix other people's houses. You come home smelling like sawdust and sweat. Do you know how embarrassing it is when my friends ask what my husband does?" Tony felt like he'd been punched in the gut. "I thought you loved me." "I did. Maybe. I don't know." Ashley stood up, wrapping herself in a robe, the silk one he bought her for Christmas. "But love isn't enough, is it? My friends' husbands are lawyers, doctors, executives. They take them to country clubs and charity dinners. What do you give me? A toolbox and promises." Derek had slipped out during this exchange, and Tony barely noticed. His entire world was collapsing, and all he could focus on was the woman he loved since college. The woman he thought would be his forever, telling him he wasn't enough. "I want a divorce," Ashley said simply. "I've already contacted a lawyer." The next few months were a special kind of hell. Ashley's lawyer son, shark in a $3,000 suit, tore through Tony's finances like a hurricane. California was a community property state, which meant Ashley was entitled to half of everything, including half the business Tony had built from the ground up. She's asking for spousal support too. Tony's lawyer, a kind older man named Robert Louis, told him during one of their meetings, "Given your income disparity and the length of the marriage, she'd probably get it." Tony sat in the modest office, his head in his hands. The irony wasn't lost on him. Ashley had complained he didn't make enough money, and now she was taking half of what he'd earned. "How much?" he asked. Robert slid a paper across the desk. The number made Tony's stomach drop. "For how long?" "Based on California law and the length of your marriage." Potentially 3 to 4 years, maybe longer, if she can prove she supported your career development during the marriage. Supported. Tony's laugh was bitter. She spent money faster than I could make it. Unfortunately, that's not quite how the court will see it. Robert said gently. She was a homemaker for most of your marriage. She gave up her career. What career? She worked part-time at the boutique for 6 months before we got married. Robert held up his hands. I'm on your side, Tony. I'm just preparing you for reality. Reality was brutal. Ashley got the house. She got half the business. She got a monthly check that was more than most people made in a year. And Tony got to start over at 35, living in a 1-bedroom apartment above a convenience store, listening to the rats in the walls and wondering where everything had gone wrong. The business suffered too. Marcus, Tony's business partner and best friend since high school, tried to keep things together, but losing half the operating capital was devastating. We're going to have to lay off some guys, Marcus said one night as they sat in the construction trailer that served as their office, going over the books. We just can't afford the payroll anymore. Tony stared at the spreadsheet, the numbers blurring together. These guys have families. Marcus. Jimmy just had a baby. Carlos is putting his daughter through college. I know. Man, I know. Marcus rubbed his face, exhausted. But we're hemorrhaging money between Ashley's settlement and the support payments. We're barely staying afloat. Tony thought about the crew. Guys who'd been with him from the beginning. Who'd believed in him when he was just a kid with a pickup truck and a dream. Now he had to look them in the eye and tell them they were out of work. Give me a week, Tony said. Let me figure something out. But there was nothing to figure out. The math was simple and unforgiving. They laid off 6 employees, keeping only the core crew. Tony took a pay cut that left him with barely enough to cover his rent and child support despite having no children. Ashley's lawyer had argued successfully that they'd been trying for children, and Ashley had put her career on hold in preparation. It was a lie, but the court believed it. The nights were the worst. Tony would lie awake in his cramped apartment, listening to the sounds of the city and replay every moment of his marriage, looking for the signs he'd missed. They'd been there. He realized Ashley's growing dissatisfaction, her cutting comments about his work, the way she'd started going out with her friends more and more often, coming home later and later. He'd ignored it all, convinced that if he just worked harder, made more money, gave her more things, she'd be happy. What a fool he'd been. His phone buzzed one night around 2 a.m. It was a number he didn't recognize, but he answered anyway. Tony, it's me. Ashley, what do you want? His voice was hoarse from lack of sleep. I wanted to check on you. Make sure you're okay. The audacity of it took his breath away. You wanted to check on me after you took everything, after you destroyed our marriage and then bled me dry in court. It doesn't have to be like this, she said, and there was something in her voice he couldn't quite identify. We could still be friends. Friends? Tony sat up, anger coursing through him. You cheated on me, Ashley, multiple times. I found out. Derek wasn't the first, was he? Silence on the other end. Was he? Tony pressed. No, she finally admitted. But Tony, You have to understand. I don't have to understand anything. Goodbye, Ashley. He hung up and blocked her number. But sleep didn't come any easier. Months turned into a year, and Tony's life became a monotonous cycle of work, bills, and loneliness. He threw himself into the business, working longer hours than ever before, trying to rebuild what Ashley had taken. But it was like swimming against a rip current no matter how hard he worked. He couldn't seem to get ahead. The monthly support payments to Ashley were a constant reminder of his failure. Every check he sent felt like another piece of his soul being torn away. Marcus worried about him. "Man, you need to take a break," he said one Saturday when he found Tony at the office, going over bids for new projects. "When's the last time you did something fun?" "Can't afford fun," Tony muttered. "Can't afford not to take care of yourself either," Marcus countered. "You're running on fumes. You look like hell." Tony caught his reflection in the dark window. Marcus was right. He'd lost weight, his eyes were hollow, and he looked a decade older than his 36 years. "Come out with me and Lisa tonight," Marcus said. "Just dinner and drinks." "My treat." Tony wanted to refuse, but something in his friend's eyes made him agree. The restaurant was nicer than anywhere Tony had been in months. Marcus and his wife Lisa kept the conversation light, carefully avoiding any mention of Ashley or the divorce. It was almost pleasant until Tony saw her. Ashley was at a corner table with another man. This one older, distinguished looking, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Tony's monthly rent. She was laughing, touching the man's arm, leaning in close. The knife in Tony's heart twisted. "Let's go," Marcus said quietly, having followed Tony's gaze. But it was too late. Ashley had seen him. Their eyes met across the restaurant, and for just a moment, Tony saw something flicker in her expression. Surprise, regret. Then it was gone, replaced by that cool indifference he'd come to know so well. She turned back to her date, dismissing Tony as if he were a stranger. 2 years after the divorce, Tony hit rock bottom. The business was struggling to stay afloat despite his best efforts. A major client had defaulted on a payment, leaving them in a cash flow crisis. The bank was threatening to call their line of credit, and Tony's landlord had just raised the rent on his apartment by 30%. He sat in his car outside the construction site they were working on, looking at his bank account on his phone. After sending this month's payment to Ashley, he had $300 to his name. $300. He'd once had dreams of building an empire, of creating something meaningful, of proving to his immigrant parents that their sacrifices had been worth it. Now he was barely surviving, paying his ex-wife to fund her lifestyle, while he ate ramen noodles and wore the same 3 shirts on rotation because he couldn't afford new clothes. Tony put his head on the steering wheel and, for the first time since the divorce, let himself cry. He cried for the marriage he'd lost, for the future he'd imagined, for the man he'd been and would never be again. He cried until his chest ached and his eyes burned, until there were no more tears left. Then he lifted his head, wiped his face, and made a decision. He was done being a victim. The next morning, Tony did something he hadn't done in 2 years. He looked at himself in the mirror, really looked and took stock. He was 37 years old. He was broken and barely holding on. But he was also still breathing, still standing, still here. That had to count for something. He thought about his father, who'd come to America with nothing and built a life through sheer determination. He thought about his mother, who'd worked 2 jobs to put him through community college. They hadn't raised a quitter. Tony pulled out a notebook and started writing. First, he wrote down everything he was grateful for. It was a short list. Marcus's friendship, his health, his skills, the fact that he still had half a business. Then he wrote down his goals. Not vague wishes, but concrete, measurable objectives. Become debt-free within 3 years. Build the business back to profitability. Become the kind of man who deserves success. Never let anyone make him feel worthless again. Finally, he wrote down the steps he needed to take to achieve those goals. It was a simple exercise, something a self-help book might recommend. But as Tony wrote, he felt something shift inside him. For the first time in 2 years, he felt something other than despair. He felt possibility. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Tony started small. He woke up an hour earlier each day and went for a run, pushing his body until his lungs burned and his legs ached. It hurt, but the pain was clean and honest. So different from the emotional anguish he'd been drowning in. After his runs, he'd shower and spend 30 minutes reading business books, biographies of successful people, anything that might give him an edge. Then he'd go to work and give it everything he had. Marcus noticed the change. "You seem different," he said one day. "Good different. I'm done being miserable," Tony replied. "Being miserable doesn't pay the bills." They started implementing new strategies in the business. Tony began networking more aggressively, joining trade associations, attending industry events. He hated the schmoozing at first, but he forced himself to do it anyway. Slowly, painfully slowly, things started to turn around. They landed a contract with a property management company to handle maintenance for their portfolio of rental properties. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was steady income. Then they got another contract, and another. Tony reinvested every penny back into the business, buying better equipment, hiring back some of the crew they lost, taking on bigger projects. At night, exhausted from 16-hour days, he'd fall into bed and sleep dreamlessly, too tired for the nightmares about Ashley that had haunted him for so long. 3 years after the divorce, something remarkable happened. Tony was at a networking event, forcing himself to make small talk with other contractors and developers. When he met James Richardson, Richardson was a real estate developer, the kind of man who thought in terms of millions instead of thousands. He was also, Tony would later learn, notorious for being extremely selective about who he worked with. Martinez Construction, Richardson said, reading Tony's business card. "I've heard good things about you." Tony was surprised. "You have. I make it my business to know the good contractors in this city," Richardson replied. "Word is you're honest, you're reliable, and you do quality work. That's rare." They talked for 20 minutes, and before the evening was over, Richardson had invited Tony to bid on a project, a boutique hotel conversion in downtown. It was the kind of project that could change everything. Tony spent 2 weeks preparing his bid, checking and rechecking every number, making sure it was competitive, but not so low that he'd lose money. He called in favors from suppliers, negotiated better rates, did everything he could to make the numbers work. When he submitted the bid, he tried not to hope too much. He'd learned that hope could be dangerous. But Richardson called him personally to tell him he'd won the contract. "Don't make me regret this," Richardson said. "You won't," Tony promised, and he meant it. The hotel project was brutal. Tony worked 18-hour days, sometimes sleeping on site to solve problems as they arose. Every penny of profit was razor-thin, every deadline critical. One mistake could bankrupt them, but Tony had learned something in his years of suffering. Pressure could either crush you or make you stronger. He chose to let it make him stronger. Marcus was right there with him, managing the crew, handling the logistics, keeping everything running smoothly. They were a team, and they were building something real. The project came in on time and under budget. Richardson was impressed enough to offer them another project, then another. Word spread in the development community. Tony Martinez was the guy who got things done, who could be trusted with complex projects, who delivered results. For years after the divorce, Martinez Construction was thriving. At age 39, Tony Martinez was unrecognizable from the broken man who'd lived above a convenience store. He'd moved into a modern condo downtown, started working out regularly, and developed a style that was polished but understated. He'd also, with the help of a business coach Marcus had recommended, begun transforming Martinez Construction from a scrappy contracting company into a legitimate construction and development firm. The best part, the spousal support payments to Ashley had finally ended. The day he made his last payment, Tony didn't celebrate. He simply noted it in his financial records and moved on. Ashley was his past, and he'd spent too many years letting his past define his future. Instead, he focused on the present. "We need to talk about expansion," Marcus said during one of their strategy sessions. They'd moved from the construction trailer to an actual office suite, with a conference room and everything. "What did you have in mind?" Tony asked, studying the financial projections on the screen. "Richardson wants us to partner with him on a new development. Mixed use, residential and commercial. He's putting up most of the capital, but he wants us to take an equity stake and handle the construction." Tony sat back. This was bigger than anything they'd done before. It was also riskier if the development failed. They could lose everything they'd built. "What's your gut say?" he asked Marcus. "My gut says we didn't come this far to play it safe." Tony smiled. "Then let's do it." The development project was transformative. Tony learned to think like a developer instead of just a contractor. He studied market trends, zoning laws, demographic shifts. He hired consultants, brought in experts, surrounded himself with people smarter than him in areas where he was weak. He also learned to delegate. For years, he'd tried to control every aspect of the business, convinced that if he wasn't personally involved, something would go wrong. Now he built a team he could trust and gave them the authority to make decisions. It was terrifying at first, letting go, but it was also liberating. With competent people handling day-to-day operations, Tony had time to focus on strategy, on big picture thinking, on building relationships with investors and partners who could help take the company to the next level. The mixed-use development was a success. Not just a success, a massive hit that transformed a neglected neighborhood into a vibrant community hub. Suddenly, everyone wanted to work with Tony Martinez. At 41, Tony sat in the office of a private wealth manager, listening to a breakdown of his net worth. Conservatively, you're looking at about 40 million, the manager said. More if some of your current projects hit their projections. $40 million. Tony thought about the apartment above the convenience store, the ramen noodles, the nights wondering if he'd ever recover from the divorce. He'd gone from nearly bankrupt to a fortune he couldn't have imagined in his darkest days. But the money wasn't what mattered most. What mattered was the man he'd become. He was disciplined, focused, confident. He built a business that employed over 100 people and created value in communities. He'd proved to himself that he could overcome anything. Ashley had been wrong. He wasn't just going somewhere he'd arrived. Tony's social life had also evolved. He dated over the years, casually, never letting anyone get too close. The scars from Ashley ran deep, and he wasn't sure he'd ever fully trust someone again. But he'd learned to enjoy his own company, to find satisfaction in his work, his friendships, his life as it was. He didn't need a woman to complete him. He was already complete, which made it all the more surprising when he felt that spark. Her name was Isabella Louis, and she walked into his life at a charity gala for local youth programs. Tony had started attending these events, not just for networking, but because he genuinely wanted to give back. He'd established a scholarship fund for kids from low-income families who wanted to learn trades. Remembering his own humble beginnings, Isabella was there representing her family's foundation. She was stunning, elegant in a simple black dress, her dark hair pulled back, her smile warm and genuine. But what caught Tony's attention wasn't her beauty. It was the way she spoke about the kids in the program, her passion for education, her vision for creating opportunities for young people. She reminded him of why he'd started this journey in the first place, not for wealth or status, but to build something meaningful. Tony Martinez, she said when they were introduced. I've been hoping to meet you. Your scholarship program is wonderful. They talked for hours, long after the formal program ended, sitting in a quiet corner of the venue while staff cleaned up around them. Tony found himself sharing stories he rarely told anyone about his parents, his struggles, his journey from failure to success. Isabella listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions, sharing her own story of growing up in a family of philanthropists and struggling to find her own path. When the evening ended, Tony realized he didn't want it to. Would you like to have dinner sometime? He asked, surprising himself with the question. Isabella's smile could have lit up the room. I'd love that. Tony approached his relationship with Isabella differently than he'd approached his marriage to Ashley. With Ashley, he'd been young, naive, convinced that love conquered all. He'd ignored red flags, made excuses for bad behavior, prioritized her happiness over his own self-respect. With Isabella, he was intentional. He took things slowly, paid attention to how she treated other people, watched for consistency between her words and actions. He was honest about his past, his fears, his boundaries, and Isabella met him with the same level of honesty and intention. She'd been through her own challenges, a broken engagement to a man who'd wanted her family's connections more than he wanted her. She understood betrayal, understood the caution that came from being hurt. They built their relationship on a foundation of mutual respect, shared values, and genuine friendship. The attraction was there intense and undeniable, but they didn't rush into anything. 6 months into dating, Isabella asked Tony a question that stopped him cold. "Do you still love her?" They were at his condo, having dinner on his balcony overlooking the city. The question came out of nowhere, and Tony knew exactly who she meant. Ashley. He considered the question carefully. "No, I don't love her. I haven't for a long time. But you're not over her," Isabella said gently. "I can see it sometimes, Tony. There's a part of you that's still locked away, still protecting yourself from what she did." Tony wanted to deny it, but Isabella deserved better than lies. "Maybe you're right," he admitted. "I don't think about her anymore. Don't wish things had been different, but I'm still careful, guarded." "I'm not asking you to be unguarded," Isabella said. "I just need to know if you have room in your heart for me. The real you, not the carefully controlled version you show the world." It was a fair question, and it deserved a fair answer. Tony reached across the table and took her hand. "I'm still learning how to do this. How to be vulnerable again without being foolish. How to trust without being naive. But yes, Isabella, I have room for you. You make me want to try." She squeezed his hand. That's all I needed to hear. 9 years after his divorce, Tony Martinez had built an empire. Martinez Development Group was now one of the most respected firms in the region, with projects across 3 states and a reputation for quality and integrity. The company employed over 300 people, and Tony had been featured in business magazines as an example of entrepreneurial resilience. But more importantly, he built a life he was proud of. He had meaningful relationships, a partner in Isabella who challenged and supported him, a sense of purpose that went beyond making money. He funded scholarships, mentored young entrepreneurs, invested in his community. The man who'd once felt worthless was now clear about his worth, and it had nothing to do with anyone else's opinion of him. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, his assistant knocked on his office door. "There's someone here to see you," Maria said, her expression odd. "She says it's personal." "Who is it?" Maria hesitated. "Ashley Martinez. I mean, she said her name was Ashley Bennett now, but she mentioned she used to be married to you." Tony's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't seen or heard from Ashley in over 9 years, not since the divorce was finalized. "Should I send her away?" Maria asked, clearly ready to play bouncer. Tony considered it. He could refuse to see her, could have security escort her out, could pretend she didn't exist the way she'd once dismissed him. But he was curious. What could she possibly want after all these years? "Give me 5 minutes," he said, "then send her in." Tony used those 5 minutes to center himself, to remember who he was now, to armor himself against whatever was coming. When Ashley walked through his office door, he was ready, except he wasn't. Not really. She was still beautiful, perhaps more so than he remembered. Though there were fine lines around her eyes and mouth that hadn't been there before. She was dressed expensively, her hair perfectly styled, her makeup flawless. But there was something in her eyes that was new. Something that looked like desperation. "Hello, Tony," she said softly. "Ashley." He kept his voice neutral, professional. "This is unexpected. I know. I'm sorry to just show up like this. Hi. I needed to see you." Tony gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Have a seat." She sat, and he could see her taking in his office the modern furniture, the floor-to-ceiling windows with views of the city, the awards and photos documenting his success. "You've done well for yourself," she said. "I've worked hard," he replied. "What can I do for you, Ashley?" She took a breath, and when she spoke, her voice cracked. "I made a mistake, Tony, the biggest mistake of my life, and I'm here to ask if there's any chance we could start over." Tony stared at her, certain he'd miss her. "Excuse me. I know how it sounds," she said quickly. "I know what I did to you was unforgivable. But Tony, I've spent the last 11 years realizing what I threw away. You were the best thing that ever happened to me, and I was too stupid and selfish to see it. You want to get back together?" Tony's voice was flat, disbelieving. "I know it's asking a lot. I know I hurt you terribly, but I've changed, Tony. I've grown up, and I've never stopped." She paused, tears forming in her eyes. "I've never stopped regretting what I did to us." Tony leaned back in his chair, studying her, part of him a small, wounded part that still remembered loving her, wanted to believe this was real. But the man he'd become knew better. "What happened to Derek?" he asked. "And the other men?" Ashley looked down. "Derek lasted about 6 months after you left. The others, none of them were serious. I was trying to fill a void, too, trying to find what I'd lost. And the man at the restaurant, the one in the expensive suit." She looked surprised that he remembered. "Richard, we dated for 3 years. I thought he was going to marry me, but it turned out he was already married. I was just his side piece." Tony felt a flicker of satisfaction at that, then immediately felt ashamed of it. "I'm sorry that happened to you," he said, and meant it. "But Ashley, I'm not sure why you're telling me this, because I want you to understand that I learned my lesson. I learned what real value is. You were building something real, something lasting, and I was too immature to appreciate it. You were the one who got away, Tony, the one I should have held onto." She reached across the desk, trying to take his hand, but Tony pulled back. "I've followed your career," she continued. "I've seen your success. I know you're with someone now, Isabella Louis. I've seen the photos. But Tony, what we had was real. First love, young love. Don't you think we deserve a second chance?" Tony stood up and walked to the window, his back to Ashley, needing space to process this surreal conversation. 11 years ago, he would have given anything to hear these words. When he was lying in that apartment above the convenience store, crying himself to sleep, he'd fantasized about Ashley realizing her mistake, begging him to take her back. But that was a different man, a different life. "Why now?" he asked, still looking out the window. "After all these years, why come back now?" Because I finally had the courage to admit I was wrong, Ashley said. And because I can't stand the thought of you marrying someone else without knowing how I feel. Tony turned to face her. How you feel? Ashley, you destroyed me. You took everything I had and walked away without looking back. Do you have any idea what the last 11 years have been like? I know. No, you don't know, Tony said, his voice hardening. You don't know what it's like to work 3 jobs to pay spousal support to someone who cheated on you. You don't know what it's like to rebuild your entire life from scratch. You don't know what it's like to learn to trust again after someone you loved betrayed you in the worst possible way. Ashley was crying now, mascara running down her cheeks. I'm sorry, Tony. I'm so sorry. I know I can never make it right. But please give me a chance to try. Tony walked back to his desk but didn't sit down. He stood there, looking at this woman who once meant everything to him and felt ... nothing. No anger, no love, no desire for revenge or reconciliation. Just nothing. I forgave you a long time ago, Ashley, he said quietly. Not for your sake, but for mine. I had to let go of the anger and the hurt to move forward. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. And it doesn't mean going back. Tony, I'm happy now. Genuinely happy. I've built a life I'm proud of with people who value me for who I am, not what I can give them. Isabella is an incredible woman who saw me at my best and my worst and chose to love me anyway. I'm not going to throw that away for a fantasy of what we used to be. But we could have that again, Ashley pleaded. We could be even better than before. You're successful now. We could have the life I always wanted. And there it was. The truth slipping out. The life you always wanted, Tony repeated. Not the life we wanted. Not a partnership. The life you wanted. Ashley realized her mistake. That's not what I meant. It's exactly what you meant, Tony said. And it's exactly what our marriage was me. Trying to give you what you wanted while losing myself in the process. I won't make that mistake again. So, that's it. Ashley stood up, her tears turning to anger. You're just going to throw away what we had. You threw it away 11 years ago, Tony said firmly. I just took out the trash. Ashley's face flushed. You're really choosing her over me? Over us? I'm choosing me, Tony said. For the first time in my life, I'm choosing what's best for me. And Ashley, you're not it. You never were. She grabbed her purse, her hands shaking. You'll regret this when your little girlfriend shows her true colors. When she leaves you just like I did. You'll realize what you gave up. Maybe, Tony said calmly, but it'll still be my choice, my decision, my life. Ashley stormed toward the door, then stopped and turned back. I loved you, Tony. I really did. Maybe you did, in your own way, Tony said. But love isn't enough without respect, without loyalty, without choosing your partner every day even when it's hard. You taught me that. So thank you. The thank you seemed to hurt her more than anything else he'd said. She left without another word, and Tony watched her go, feeling lighter than he had in years. He picked up his phone and called Isabella. Hey, she answered, her voice warm. How's your day going? Better than expected, Tony said, smiling. Want to have dinner tonight? I have something I want to ask you. Mysterious. I like it. What time? 7. I'll cook. You're cooking. Now I'm really intrigued. After they hung up, Tony stood by his window, looking out at the city he'd conquered, the empire he'd built, the life he'd created from the ashes of his worst failure. Ashley had been wrong about so many things, but she'd been right about one. He had become successful, just not in the way she'd imagined, and certainly not for the reasons she thought. He'd become successful because he'd learned that true wealth had nothing to do with money and everything to do with character. He'd learned that you can't build a future on the foundation of someone else's expectations. He'd learned that the only person who needed to believe in him was himself. Most importantly, he'd learned that real love wasn't about being completed by someone else. It was about being whole on your own and choosing to share that wholeness with someone who did the same. That evening, Tony prepared Isabella's favorite meal, set the table on his balcony with candles and flowers, and waited for her to arrive. When she did, she took one look at the setup and laughed. Okay, you're either about to propose or break up with me. I can't tell which. Neither, Tony said, pulling out her chair. I just wanted to do something nice for the woman I love. They ate and talked, and Tony told her about Ashley's visit, about the closure he'd found in finally letting go of that chapter of his life. How do you feel? Isabella asked. Free, Tony said. For the first time since the divorce, I feel completely free. I spent so many years carrying around that pain, that sense of failure. But seeing her today, hearing what she had to say, I realized that her leaving was the best thing that ever happened to me. Why is that? Because it forced me to become the man I was always meant to be. If we'd stayed together, I would have spent my whole life trying to make her happy, shrinking myself to fit into her vision of what I should be. Instead, I got to build myself from scratch. I got to choose who I wanted to become. Isabella reached across the table and took his hand. And who did you choose to become? Tony smiled. Someone worthy of you. You were always worthy, Tony. You just needed to see it yourself. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Tony spoke again. I want you to know something. What we have this relationship, this partnership, it's not about what you can give me or what I can give you. It's about who we are together, how we challenge and support each other, how we make each other better. I know that, Isabella said. Good, because I'm not looking for someone to complete me. I'm looking for someone to share my life with. Someone who has their own dreams and goals and purpose. Someone who chooses me every day the way I choose them. Is this your way of asking me to move in with you? Isabella teased. Actually, Tony pulled a small box from his pocket. It's my way of asking you to marry me. Isabella's eyes widened as he opened the box, revealing a ring he'd had custom designed, elegant and unique, just like her. I know we've only been together for a year and a half, Tony said. And I know I have baggage from my first marriage. But Isabella, you've shown me what real love looks like. You've shown me what it means to be partners, to build something together while still being individuals. I don't want to spend another day without knowing that we're building a future together. Isabella's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. Are you sure? Really sure? Because, Tony, I need you to know that I'm not interested in your money or your success. I'd love you if you were still living above that convenience store. I know, Tony said. That's why I'm asking. Then yes, she said, laughing and crying at the same time. Yes, of course I'll marry you. Tony slipped the ring on her finger and pulled her close, kissing her as the sun set over the city, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. In that moment, Tony Martinez understood something profound. Success wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It wasn't about revenge or vindication or showing his ex-wife what she'd missed. Success was about becoming the best version of yourself and sharing that with someone who appreciated it. It was about building a life of purpose and meaning, surrounded by people who valued you for who you were, not what you could give them. Ashley had wanted him back because of what he'd become. Isabella loved him because of who he was. That made all the difference. 1 year later, Tony and Isabella were married in a small ceremony surrounded by close friends and family. Marcus was his best man. James Richardson attended, along with dozens of other colleagues and associates. Tony had built relationships with over the years. Ashley was not invited. Tony heard through the grapevine that she'd moved to another city, was working as a real estate agent, still searching for the wealthy husband who could give her the lifestyle she craved. He wished her well, genuinely, and then never thought about her again. Martinez Development Group continued to grow, expanding into sustainable development and affordable housing projects. Tony had found his calling not just in building structures, but in building communities, creating opportunities for others the way opportunities had been created for him. He and Isabella started a foundation together, combining their resources and passions to support education and entrepreneurship in underserved communities. They traveled, they laughed, they built a life that was richer than any bank account could measure. Sometimes, late at night, Tony would think back to that apartment above the convenience store, to the broken man who wondered if he'd ever recover from his divorce. He'd recovered. More than recovered, he'd transformed. The betrayal that had nearly destroyed him had actually set him free. It had forced him to rebuild himself from the foundation up, to develop the character and resilience that would carry him through any challenge. He'd gone from a man defined by his failures to a man defined by his choices. From someone who needed validation from others to someone who validated himself. From a victim of circumstances to an architect of his own destiny. And that, Tony realized, was worth more than any fortune. The $1 billion comeback wasn't about the money he'd made or the empire he'd built. It was about the man who'd become, a man who knew his worth, who chose his battles wisely, who loved deeply but never lost himself in the process. As he stood on the balcony of the home he and Isabella had bought together, looking out at the city lights, Tony felt a profound sense of peace. He'd started with nothing, lost everything, and rebuilt himself into something stronger than he'd ever been. That was the real comeback. That was the real success. Tony's finally choosing himself and finding real love with someone who values him for who he truly is. If this story touched your heart, don't hesitate to like, subscribe, and share.